Chinese president is in Rwanda, of course, making him the first president of China to touch ground right here in Rwanda. Of course, earlier on, we thought that we'll not be able to have the show, and it made me feel like crying. Oh, but we're here, and we are definitely going to be analyzing this visit and what it means, plus, of course, broaden the conversation to Africa. What does the China-Africa relation mean? And, of course, try to debunk some of the myths as far as economic implications are concerned of a China-Africa relation. This program is interactive. You can definitely be able to get in touch with us. Our Twitter hashtag is InFocusRW. You can tweet and add that particular hashtag, and we'll be able to sample your tweets in the course of the program. My name, as always, is Eugene Anangwe. Let's take a look at what is already being said concerning this particular visit of the Chinese president here in Rwanda. One of them is from Richard Nimwenshuti, who says, first, this is an endorsement and recognition of the leadership of President Paul Kagame. It's a confirmation that Rwanda and Africa presents opportunities to the high tables d'honneur. I salute His Excellency and the chairman of AU for a good foreign cooperation. Definitely, that is his opinion on that particular issue. But of course, there is a gentleman here called Kenneth, where is it? Yes, Kenneth Vyayezu, who actually feels that there is a sense of importance. How much do African countries gain in these bilateral trade agreements with China in long run? Hope will not be blamed by our grandchildren on terrible deals. What if Africa has got a new colonial master? This is the question that he has over there. So you can definitely be able to keep tweeting, add the hashtag InFocusRW. We'll be able to sample these particular tweets in the course of the program. Let me introduce our who's actually the Secretary, Rwanda-China Alumni Organization. Thank you so much for joining us on the program, Norbert. Also with us is Emery Nzirawatinya, who's actually an expert on foreign relations. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Also, we have none other than Sir Ken Agutamba. He's actually a columnist with the New Times of Rwanda. History is made, gentlemen. And of course, first of all, I want to start with you, Norbert, because you have been in China for 13 years. You lived there, studied there, and of course, you came back to Rwanda, I think, in 2013. 15, sorry. And it's important for you to tell us or share with us a bit about what this visit really means for that Rwandan who has lived to see this day today. What sort of things do you think they should be taking out of this visit today?
Well, on a personal level, it's quite a significant day, actually. I feel very happy. Having lived in China for that long, I consider China as my second home. So really, it's like my own destiny being expressed in front of me. I'm very, very happy to see President Xi coming here. And for Rwanda, this is also very important because, first of all, wherever this particular president of China is extremely popular in his country, he's considered as the best or the most important president they've had for the last 40 years or so, maybe even longer. And so every move that he makes is followed, and him coming to Rwanda means that more Chinese are going to be interested in Rwanda, both for tourism, for investment, and just really get interested into the country. And also, as he comes to visit the chairman of the African Union, it shows that the respect that he has for the institution, for our president, and I think, as usual, the president of China actually visit Africa, I think, in the first country, in the first region he visits after Chinese New Year. And so it's very, very significant.
Very significant.
Yes.
Right. I mean, how about you, Emery? I mean, how do you read this from foreign relations perspective, especially also looking at the choice of the African states that he has actually decided to visit in this very important trip, as Norbert puts it, Senegal, Rwanda, South Africa. How significant is this?
Thank you. First of all, I think in terms of significance, I would just put it straight up and say that it's groundbreaking as far as diplomacy is concerned, as Africa is concerned, because when you go back to the Vienna Conventions of 1963, and that is VCDR, that is Vienna Conventions on Diplomatic Relations, Rwanda opened relations with China in 1971. We're only having the first Chinese president come to visit Rwanda. 2018, you look at, we've been having diplomatic relations for the last 47 years. What does that tell you?
What
That's
does
one.
it tell us? I mean,
It does tell you that for sure, if we just take like a historical journey for Rwanda, for the last 24 years, we are who we are, given the fact that we got a government that came in and decided that enough is enough, and we need to change the paradigmatic shift, and Rwanda needs to go to the next page. In 24 years only, if I start to talk in terms of numbers, in terms of GDP, we are growing at a rate of 7%. China is a country, when you go back and look at Deng Xiaoping, that is from 1975, and he changed the whole game plan. And actually he was smart enough to use a particular model that was being used back then by the Chinese, what we call the Silk Road trade. And the beauty about the Chinese, so that we can come back home, we relate,
yes,
why this is important, is that actually this is one country that if you go back, before we come to the Silk Road, if you go back to the Cold War era, that's about from 1950s to somewhere around 1989, 1990, we were almost at par. Africa and China were in an aligned movement. We were trying not to lie on the capitalist bloc, neither on the communist bloc. And by this time, you're seeing China in 2018, it's already a superpower. Look at the numbers. It's got 1.4 billion people in population, the largest in the world. Look at Rwanda. We are merely 12 million. So the choice for the Chinese government to pick Rwanda out of the rest of the countries, and of course it's Senegal, Rwanda, Mauritius, and South Africa, it does tell you that these are people who are looking, and they're using a political beam to analyze and say, there should be something in that government.
That place is ripe for us to go.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm going to come back to you, but let's also hear from Sir Agutamba here. I mean, if President Kagame was not the chairman of the African Union, do you think the Chinese president would have picked Rwanda among these countries that he's visiting here today? Because Emery talks of 1971, that is when the relations began, but 2018 is when he comes to visit Rwanda.
So actually in November it will be 47 years. So perhaps it was just about time that we got a Chinese president to come down here. But you ask a question, if President Paul Kagame wasn't at the AU, would he come? There's a lot in common between President of China, Xi, and President Paul Kagame. If you look at their style of leadership, currently you have to look at three things why this president is visiting Rwanda at this point in time. There are three phases. The first phase is a bilateral phase, China, Rwanda. Yes. There's the second phase, which is Africa, China. And then there's the third phase, which is the world. If you look at the current dynamics, there's a bit of a global leadership crisis at the moment. If you look at all the top global centers of power, there's a political crisis, a leadership crisis of sorts. There's a lot of nationalism rising. Go to the US, yes, you know, you see that if you... When was the last time Africa appeared in their top stories? It was only recently when an African migrant in France did a heroic act of rescuing a kid. But mainly the news is concentrating on the president and all matters America. Go to Britain, they're struggling with the Brexit. You know, the British people don't want anything to do with leading Europe anymore. France is trying to fill that space, but France is not adequate. There are issues in Germany. So when you look at that, it's a time for, this visit is in particular going to discuss a lot of high-level global leadership crisis, and as the chairman of African Union and the leader of China, which is a contender to be the next superpower after US, if the US decides we are no longer interested in being a world leader, because I mean, we had Greece, we had the Roman Empire, we had Great Britain, we have USA. Who is next? Perhaps China. But for many years, for decades, China has been shying away from this global leadership. Right. It's about time they actually now need to put up their face out and take charge, because there's a clear gap and we need a leader. On the African continent, when you look at leadership, you look at people like President Paul Kagame, and it's by coincidence he's the chairman of the African Union. That makes it a very balanced conversation, because he won't talk as a leader of Rwanda. He will be talking as a leader of an African bloc, engaging with the leader of another superpower. And for me, this conversation, I want it to go beyond today, to get us to a point where maybe Africa should engage to actually boost its voice at the UN, where global decisions are made.
Right.
I've been wondering, and this is my last remark before you go away. Look at the current balance of the veto powers. 3 of them belong to the same alliance. You have France, you have Britain, you have US. The only balancing forces, you have China and you have Russia. I've always thought, and I know it's a minority thought, what if Africa got a veto vote? That would be the perfect balancing of the current global status quo, because now you would have 3 powers that are kind of neutral to African affairs: Russia, China, then Africa voting as a bloc and engaging or being able to block certain decisions that would affect issues in Africa.
Coming into Africa. Norbert, you wanted to come in, but of course, as you come in, I would like you to also chip in onto what Ken has just alluded to here. He says or speaks of China being a possible next superpower if the US actually decides not to take that particular position. But for most of the time, we've seen China, as far as its foreign policy is concerned, it's when it's relating with other countries, matters to do with domestic politics, China never wants to even go deep into that. I mean, they have their way of doing that, which we'll actually delve deep into. But do you think China would be interested in such a thing, in such a position, of taking over as the next superpower if the US does not want to take this leadership role?
I think it's something that China ultimately will get to, because when you look at history, China and India, in fact, those were 2 biggest powers in the world, I think for more than a millennium, before around the 18th century. That's when Europe took over. So when you look at the population of China, when you look at how the land is, because China basically is 2 Nile rivers next to each other in a 1,000-kilometer long valley. It's really blessed geographically. That's why China is the way it is. It has an enormous valley, which is flat, which is good for agriculture, and the problems they used to have in the past with flooding has been solved through technology. And it goes back to what Kenneth was saying, that President Xi is monumental because he brought this One Belt, One Road. Now, to understand One Belt, One Road, and as his main policy of President Xi, which is something that is now in the constitution of China, as well as President Xi Jinping's thought, the objective of the One Belt, One Road, really for China, is to open up its opportunities globally.
And connect.
Yes. Yeah, and be the one who is connecting. So this is already a challenge to America. This is a way of saying, we see what you're doing, this is how we're going to do things differently.
Right.
We're going to go with the connecting, we're going to go with the infrastructure. We're not going to go with the democracy and the interfering in internal affairs or in this and that. We're just going to go do business.
Right.
So that's why, going back to what I wanted to talk about earlier, is the choice of these countries that the President Xi has chosen. I think it's quite significant. There is no country with significant oil reserves or natural resources. Look at Senegal, Rwanda, Mauritius, even South Africa is a bit of different because of the BRICS summit, which is going to attend. And South Africa is a very important partner for China. But when you look at the countries that he chose, I think he's trying to send a message, which is we are interested in development. We are interested in collaboration. We are not just here to take your minerals.
Right.
But of course, I'm not saying that the Chinese are only good for Africa. China is a partner so far. It's a good partner for Africa. But I think what is important is what role that us Africans are going to play
in these partnerships.
In this partnership, because when you look at Belt and Road Initiative, which is really the most important policy, foreign policy for China for the next 10 to 20 years, maybe even beyond, Africa is a very passive participant to this process. It is not correct. I think that Africa should have a voice to say, we see this Belt and Road Initiative, we see it is connecting countries like Iran, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan and Russia, which we don't really have any commercial contact with.
Yes.
This is something that we could benefit from. I would love to see Rwandan coffee being sold in Kazakhstan. But I think one of the reasons why President Xi chose to come to Rwanda this time, and why I think the 2 leaders, President Kagame and President Xi, will get along very well, and like you said, that they will have very similar way of rolling, is the CFTA and the Continental Free Trade Agreement and the Belt and Road Initiative are actually quite similar in the way that they're set up.
Interest-based
kind of. So they're trying to, both leaders are trying to, they're trying to create new ways of people interacting with each other. They're trying to remove barriers.
Right.
When you look around the world, it's the other way around. People are trying to raise up barriers. So I think that this is a very, very important common point that I believe they will be discussing with. And personally, I would really love to see an integration of the Continental Free Trade Area with the One Belt, One Road, and it will create a massive market for the global
world. Emery, if you look at it from that perspective of, you know, most people have actually been arguing and saying that there is sort of a scramble for Africa. When you look at the opportunities that Africa is making today, the growth of the continent, or how do you think Washington is viewing this visit today as we speak?
It would be interesting for sure, and that's a good question. But if we want to go into the White House and try to see, rather Capitol Hill, and try to see probably what is making them not have normal nights, so to speak, you would actually come back. It would take you a couple of years, like say 4 to 3 years, to see what has the West been doing in as far as their foreign relations or maybe foreign policy approach towards Africa, maybe sub-Saharan. And you'll find that actually they have their own share of problems in as much as they don't, the international media does not actually share it with us.
Yes.
And a couple of things that you would come up and you would want to share would be, beat the West in terms of like the United States and Europe, European meaning European Union. They somewhat seem that they have, because of the problems they have, somewhat stepped behind or maybe took 4 or 3 steps behind in terms of gearing up for globalization. Now, this is an advantage that actually the Chinese have actually seen and took advantage of. But for you to unpack that so that you can be in a position to understand it, you have to be informed by how the Chinese operate.
Right.
So pretty much Chinese are informed by actually their historical and cultural way of life. When I was talking about the Silk Road, and I think my 2 good colleagues alluded to it, it requires you to go back to about 130 BCE, before Common Era. And here we are talking about the Han Dynasty. It is something that is very critical because that is during the Han Dynasty is when the Chinese were really flourishing with the Silk Road trade.
Trading with Rome.
Trading with Rome, thank you. And that was the Roman civilization, and coming towards inward, towards the Arab and everything. But now, one thing that needs to be understood was that from China to where the Silk Road was stopping was about like 7,000 kilometers. I know Haguma speaks good Mandarin, and maybe he can correct me on this one. But there's a Chinese proverb which, if I was to translate it in English, says, for one to go for development, you only need to construct a road.
Yes.
Okay, that's very important. That tells you something. So one thing that also makes you come into perspective and see that it does make sense. You come to the times of Chairman Mao. China was facing a lot of problems. Of course, Chairman Mao was trying to do a couple of tidbits here and there to try and see whether they can have a clear political and economic platform. Fairly enough, but it didn't work out. But there's a gentleman you need to come out and appreciate. And actually what people are not seeing is that the Chinese have got a 100-year program. We are starting from 1949. That is from the time of Chairman Mao. And that's actually when you can say that the People's Republic of China was formed. We go to 2049. That is when they will be celebrating what actually my colleague Haguma and Khan were trying to allude to, the issue of the Belt and Road Initiative. What does the Belt and Road Initiative tell you? Of course, I won't say so much because they did a good job. But actually, you need to look at it as the inland and the maritime. So for the inland, you're looking at these guys cutting across from China, Kazakhstan, towards Middle East, towards Europe. Now, they'll come down and use, and you need to be careful here. They are trying to concentrate and make sure that they control the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. They know the Atlantic is something else. So as long as you can control those two, because they've been having problems as far as security is concerned with Southeast Asia,
right,
as far as security issues together with the Russians and, of course, the Americans coming into play. But what is important at the moment is that actually, what is the Belt and Road Initiative trying to tell us?
Right.
The other day, they just opened a port in Djibouti. And I like their way of doing things, because if I was to remember and quote Deng Xiaoping, he did say, and I quote, that the Chinese, and that was in 1975, that by now when we create this project, we are supposed to go slow. We are not supposed to let anyone understand what is our general approach and agenda until things come to place. End of quote. So that tells you that actually China is a country in itself that you need to be very careful about. And if you were to debunk this, it does tell you, and just to allude to what Agatumba was trying to tell us, is that actually, and I agree with him, only that what I need to add is that I already feel they're there. And how long did it take them to be the second strongest economic country in the world? A couple of years, not much, and they deposed Japanese.
Right.
You see?
Yep.
So it does tell you something.
It tells you something, and of course it's important for us to also to try and look into the economic impact, what is perceived as the economic impact of the China-Africa relations, because a lot of people have actually been saying that, and even Emery alluded to that we need to be a bit careful, and some of these things you might not know what the real interest is or what the real game plan is until it bursts on your face. And of course, it's important for us to share this. Agutamba, I mean, most people have actually said that we need to be careful. African countries are sort of giving themselves away to China. And, you know, we've heard what the U.S. president has been constantly saying about, you know, China and its model. I want to read your thoughts on whether you feel this is just a myth or it's a fact, especially when you look at the issues to do with neocolonialism. Some people feel that this is a new type of colonialism because we are going to end up ceding more power to these guys in the interest of the infrastructure that we so badly need. I mean, do you see this as a myth or a fact?
Look, that's a really controversial question, and everybody around the globe is trying to kind of answer it. Most people, I don't think, are being fair to the Chinese. And as Africans, I also don't think we are putting it in the right frame of analysis. But I want to go to where you started, the previous point you raised, that, you know, China seems not to be interested in the domestic affairs of countries. I'll tell you two things. Actually, it's one. You have to look at China and compare its approach on Africa to the West's approach.
Right.
And two words. While the West seeks to dominate, China seeks to influence, but without dominating. You know, look at two products. Look at the iPhone, look at the Techno. The iPhone screams superior. That's imperialism. Look at the Techno. Everybody has it in Africa. So when you look at everyone's household in Africa, there's a piece of China in their house. Just think about it as you know, you're here on the panel. There's a piece of China in your room. But in terms of top of mind, the image of the president of China rarely fills our mind compared to the image of the president of
the US.
whether US or these other countries. That tells you a lot. So for many years, China has been careful not to be seen to be imposing itself on Africa, but to actually do a lot to be in our lives. And that's what you see. They're in our lives in terms of affordable electronics. I don't want to use the word cheap. They're in our lives in terms of agriculture. They are deep. My first story that I did in this country as a journalist involved the Chinese agriculture project in the southern province. And you know how much agriculture means to Africa. So in as far as they are trying to influence without dominating, there are issues cropping up. And I think these are issues that President Xi and his administration are kind of concentrating on in his government. I know Haguma will agree that in the past few years, social media has changed the mentality of Chinese. In the past, they used to say these people didn't have a voice to engage with the government. Right now, there's a new movement of anti-corruption, you know, movement, but inspired by social media. You know, on Weibo, which is their version of Twitter, and WeChat, You see a government official who seems to be too rich compared to his salary, a conversation will start, and the current government of President Xi is quite very serious on the issue of corruption. But now that brings you the conversation of what is China doing to fight corruption in Africa.
Right.
And that's where a conversation gets interesting, because China has been investing in Africa. All these investments you're looking at, you know, oil in Sudan, the railway in Kenya, which is causing a controversy, and everywhere they are. These are investments. And I can tell you that when I was there as a student, doing my master's in international communication, there was a conversation on, I was following the banks there. The same banks that are giving us this money to do these investments. They are struggling to recoup this money. Now, when this money comes here and our leaders steal it or embezzle it, it's causing problems back in China, because people are now starting to ask, what are you investing in Africa? Where are the returns? Right. So 10 years from now, and we can watch this, China is going to be forced to kind of revise its approach on Africa, to actually have a tough conversation on leaders that, look, we really don't want to dominate, but...
Would they be going the direction of the Western nations?
I don't think they're going to go that way. I think that for China, things like fighting corruption in Africa is a very, very low priority as subject. Because China really does not have the capacity to even implement if they wanted to do that. They are still building the international research capacity. They're still building their diplomacy. Yes, they are here in Africa, but they're here for business. It takes really a lot of understanding to figure out what is going on with the corruption in Rwanda, when China itself is still trying to figure out how to solve its own corruption issues. But what I think that it's going to happen, it's already happening, is that China is having this kind of sharing of experience with African countries in terms of dealing with pollution, dealing with corruption, and dealing with security and all these matters. But what I personally do not even want to see is China trying to come into our governance and telling us you should be doing this and this and that.
I think they want to do that. They want to do that.
I hope they will never do that.
They will make... Look,
what would be the pros and cons of either not doing that or doing that? Because
actually, if you may allow, sorry to cut you short, because this is getting interesting a little bit. I don't think I'm going to agree with my two colleagues, but in principle, I will try and buy a couple of leaves from them. But this is what I would try to put across. I think the Chinese are smart enough, because what they are doing at our doorsteps right now is that actually they are using soft diplomacy.
Yes.
And they are using soft diplomacy on an array of different platforms. The West uses hard diplomacy. Go back to the 70s, 80s. They used structural adjustments programs on us, right? And we do well in terms of like understanding that. And to try and connect that with your earlier question in terms of
neocolonialism.
Of neocolonialism. I don't even want to waste so much time on that, because one, yes, Africa was colonized. So what? So what? Because we don't have time to go back and start whining again.
Right.
It did happen, fine, but it's time for us to rise. But in terms of how the Chinese are going to be doing this, it will go back to the other question you did raise earlier, and you did ask us, and I think Aguma did a good job by trying to tackle that, when you asked us that why the 4 countries, why did they choose those 4 countries? And that's where soft diplomacy comes in. They are not going to, as Aguma says, of course, they're not going to come in and say, we need you guys, look here, we're going to give you $50 billion US, but we need you to start putting your house in order in this sector, in that sector, and in that other sector. No, that's not what they're going to do. But actually, they will talk to you in what we call secret diplomacy, in terms of letting you understand that actually, if we are choosing to talk to Kagame, His Excellency, if we are choosing to talk to His Excellency Macky Sall, if we are choosing to talk to His Excellency Ramaphosa, and so, you know, it does tell you, these other presidents don't think we are on this panel this night, and don't think other people are not seated wondering,
why not
some
us?
of these, probably, why not us? That should be the fundamental question, you see. So, let's not probably hoodwink a little bit to think that actually they don't see that. I agree with you, Haguma, when you say, yes, they are looking into partnering in mining, construction, and of course they have a share of problems back at home.
Yes.
You know best because you've been there. But coming back to the 4th thing, is that actually what you need to understand is that they are smart. They're smart in the context that their move is very calculative. They are moving step by step, knowing that at this particular juncture, they will do a retrospect and understand where they've come from.
All this
and
time.
yes, and how are we going?
Right.
Now, next time, the next time you see a Chinese president visiting Africa, you need to watch out and understand why is he visiting those countries. Today is when it is making probably headlines. Why Rwanda?
Well, but then also, talking of and brushing off the issue of colonization and saying we were colonized, so what? But then take a look at it from this perspective, because critics of China usually say that African countries are loading themselves with Chinese debt, which is going to be very difficult for them to actually pay off. For example, in Kenya, over 70% of its external debt is Chinese debt.
Right.
When we look at Guinea, a very small country growing, it is actually taking in $20 billion from China.
Right.
The worry here is this: what happens when these countries are not able to pay off these debts from
Right.
China? Kenyans on social media have been saying that we have already been colonized. China owns us. How do you explain this to people who feel that the strategies, the calculations that he talks about are geared towards achieving this result?
Well, I have two answers for that.
Yes.
So the first one is, why will Africans allow themselves to be colonized again? Like we haven't been through it, like we're passive. Like I think it's very condescending to really assume that the Chinese will want to colonize us and will just lay and let it happen. I don't think that will be the case. Secondly, to understand the Belt and Road Initiative and why China is pushing this infrastructure development, I actually had this conversation with many Chinese friends while this Belt and Road Initiative was still being developed in the early days of President Xi, and I wanted to know why is he's doing. And I came to understand that there is a very important reason why China is doing this. So apart from the geostrategic advantages of having a route that cuts through Pakistan, bypassing the choke points of the Malacca Straits, where the Americans can decide any day to block oil coming from the Middle East to China, and also creating a direct route to Europe, again to avoid the dominance of American Navy.
Right.
That is the obvious things that President Xi had to deal with. But he had even a more important problem, which at that time, in 2012, China had about $4,000 billion in foreign reserves. And because they had been the factory of the world for a long time. And they wanted to see something they can do with this money. So they had one opportunity, invest this into American treasuries. They did that for a long time, and then the Americans took out Gaddafi, which was very hurtful for the Chinese. They saw that, okay, so we are working with these people, giving them money, and they don't seem to recognize or even appreciate this gesture. And also, when you look at it from a banker's point of view, you don't give money to a 70 years old, no matter how successful he is. You give money to an 18 years old who has his whole life to develop. So when they look at Africa, that's what they see. They see a continent which has at least 50 years of fast development ahead, which means that you can actually, if their money fails in Kenya, but it works in Tanzania, the Chinese will not be that unhappy. I don't think the issue is saying every country in which we go, our investment has to bring results. What the Chinese are really trying to do, to understand the core intentions, they have this huge amount of money that they can either put it to American treasuries or they can put into African railways. And a railway will keep on growing in value. The interest will keep coming, and even if they don't come, the infrastructure is there.
But someone has to pay back for it.
Yes, I understand. So that's what I'm getting at.
Yes.
The Chinese, of course, like Kenneth said, that they are worried about the corruption in these countries where they're giving money. What I don't agree with you is the method that they're using to deal with this problem. They will not come into your country and say you need to change this and that. And no, they will just say, this is our new application form. You don't fill these criteria, you don't get money. And countries will adapt.
Simple. Absolutely.
Let's still stick or stay on the issue of the debts, and because I mean it's important to share to speak about this. I want to understand from you, Emery, whether you feel this is a myth or a fact. For those who feel that their countries are getting into more debt, Chinese debt, that they feel worried that even new babies being born today are actually born with a debt that they'll have to pay off in one day or sometime. And they feel that they might have to actually give over their controlling stakes to the Chinese as far as controlling and managing this important assets are concerned? I mean, is this a myth or a fact?
So as far as myth and fact model is concerned, let's accept that actually it's a fact. Debts are there. But is it a myth? So for us to debunk that, we would actually come back to ourselves and put aside the Chinese for a minute and ask ourselves, now, wait a minute. We're in 2018, 21st century. Here we have new partners in cooperation and development. And exactly which road do we want to pursue? But it does not stop there, Anangwe. It does come back to us to see the good things probably the African Union is trying to do. But it also doesn't stop at the African Union level. It does stop within the domestic national.
Yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. You see, so that means that any polity here meaning state, any polity, first of all, will have to put its house in order in terms of governance, in terms of building structures, in terms of building institutions, so that you can have sustainable economic development. And this is where these guys, when they come back, and that's when you need to, and where I allude to the good point, Haguma is trying to say that they would give you a checklist. Do you meet this? Do you not? Okay, we are not in business. Soft diplomacy, standard. But true, debts are there. Myth or no myth, again, it's a fact within the context of the myth that actually African governance should be put into place. Now, what do I mean by that? This is 2018. I have seen the West trying to tell us, for example, let me borrow a leaf from Rwanda. Let's start from home. And I've seen a couple of Western countries, or rather countries who didn't feel good that actually the constitution of Rwanda was being changed. And actually the intonation of that did not go well, because you still see the imperialistic hangover, which is trying to come back and tell you, we are not happy with what the Rwandese are doing. But something is not happening with the Chinese. When President Xi Jinping, the constitution was changed, the West did not do anything about that. Why? For example, you need to understand that actually the US has got a debt of the Chinese, a couple of billions, which I don't want to go into.
A couple of thousand billions.
Thank you. So they do know that this is a guy, who are we to go to tell them, change their constitution? And you see, Xi Jinping was actually more or less like handpicked by former President Hu Jintao. And Hu Jintao just picked the guy. And he's doing a great job. So probably they were waiting, since that is the regime model, that someone else will be picked by Xi Jinping. That's not what we'll be seeing anytime soon. Whether he's president for life or not, who knows?
Yeah,
but the question for Africans is that we need to put our house in order. We need to stop Western headmasters to tell us when to do our homework or not. Because the homework belongs to us.
I want to add a small point.
I
want to add a small point on what he's saying.
Yes.
There's always this question being asked, whether it's in Chinese investors having problems in Zambia or in Nigeria, and then Chinese investors thriving in Rwanda. You need to understand that in the 54 African countries, we all have different ways of doing things.
Yes.
And if you don't have rules in place that allow for a Chinese to be an investor only when he has the capacity to be an investor, or as it was in case in Zambia, where you had Chinese selling chicken in the market, if you don't have measures to stop that, of course bad things are going to happen. And in fact, it will be bad for the bilateral relations between China and Africa. So you also have to bring in the responsibility of these African governments to say, well, I'm doing things right in order to protect my country. And it's the same thing with when it comes to debt. Right. Debt sometimes is a way of coming out of crisis or coming out of a very, very complicated case. We have countries in Africa that do not even have an economy, that need a railway in order to just get things started. Are you never going to build a railway? Are you going to wait for the country to be peaceful and happy and then build a railway? So when you look at China's policy, it actually has been kind of consistent.
Right.
When they built in the 70s the Tazara Railway from Tanzania to Zambia, it was a political move, but it was also a way of saying, this is China's contribution to Africa. We're kickstarting things. Chinese, like he said, I actually want to add a bit of soft power to you for that Chinese proverb. It's say, that's how you say, if you want to,
there he goes.
you want to develop. So basically, the Chinese really do, I think they really do need, that's my main point, I think China is a bit lonely on the world stage, like Kenneth said. I think they need a strong Africa to be an ally. I think that is the most important reason why China needs Africa. Of course, we have the resources, we have the trade relations, but they really see Africa as a place which is far enough to not have immediate geostrategic tensions,
Right.
because China has tensions with all its neighbors. When you look at Vietnam, when you look at India, every single country around China, they have issues. Because we are not borders, we can be friends. So China sees Africa as potentially its best friend at the United
midst
Nations.
of all this.
In the midst of all of this.
Right.
So what they would like to see is Africa developed. I really believe that.
Right. It's important for us to sort of bring on the table the negotiating power and the people who negotiate on behalf of us who don't make it to that particular table where they have this sort of deals that are struck. And it's important that, Haguma did mention earlier on when we were starting this particular conversation that we need to also see what role Africans are going to play in this partnership, because we should not always be just waiting for what is China going to bring on the table.
Yeah.
Agutamba, I want to bring you on this, because how then can local citizens who cannot be able to make it on that boardroom meeting where these deals are signed, these deals are struck, what sort of role can they play to ensure that they end up with deals that will favor them, or will be not deals that will bring issues for generations to come?
That's a good point you raised, but before I touch it, I want to say two things. In terms of taking on a lot of Chinese debt, Africa seems to have treated, or we still treat China as a credit card. And we kind of seem to be assured of credit every time we have something to finance, because we know the strings are not that tight, because we know the voice won't be so strong to tell us do A, B, C, D.
Right.
But let me tell you, if I'm to borrow something from the insurance business, when you take out a life insurance policy, the insurance company prays so hard that you don't die and that they don't have to pay you out. So what do I mean here? The more Africa takes on Chinese debt, is the more China is going to be very, very interested in what is going on in Africa.
Yes.
In terms of stability, in terms of return to investment of these same projects you're talking about, pretty much in terms of everything. Now, the question is, when you talk about debt, you're basically, by principle, you're talking about the taxpayers in those. And the question is, are Africans doing a good job negotiating with the, because this is business.
Yes.
Like we said, we look at China as a business partner, brother.
Yes.
But China is also interested in doing business with a good partner, not just any partner,
Yes.
you know.
Yes.
So are Africans or are our countries being good partners in doing this? That's a conversation we need to have within us as Africans. And maybe, and this is my opinion,
Yes.
what I would like to see China do more is that its diplomacy has mainly been concentrating at state to state, you know, and people to people, public, what you would call public diplomacy. It's quite active. He's gone to school on the Chinese scholarship. I did, and so many others did. But in terms of engagement and trying to pick out voices of these people, ordinary voices of Africans, ordinary voices of Chinese interacting and having these voices apart from the boardrooms of state to state, those are the voices we need to hear. Because like in Kenya, for example, the voices we are hearing of ordinary Kenyans don't seem to be happy,
Yes.
yet on the outside, the project that the Chinese negotiated with the Kenyan government is seen as a good project. So there is a gap, you know, in terms of bringing individual voices to the table and to harmonize and actually, probably even it's an issue of governance and accountability. What are these people talking about in this closed,
Would the governments have any power to change anything if the citizens, as you said, like it is in Kenya right now, where they're talking about the standard gauge railway and the way they are being treated and all that? What sort of powers or leverage do the individual governments have on the table as far as changing the dynamics of these agreements with a partner who is actually financing a major project that you want to use, to either, speak of your achievements as a politician, for example, in countries where this is happening? What powers do these governments have in such cases to actually change the rule of the game when they have already engaged with the Chinese in this partnership that they have, where citizens on the local level feel that they are being taken for a ride?
Cool. So I'll look at it twofold. I look at it twofold in terms of, like, when you talk about governments being able, you'll have a government which is a legitimate government. You have a government which is not legitimate. Now, a government which is not legitimate,
yes,
definitely it doesn't require rocket science for you to understand that it is not going to serve the interest of the masses or the critical mass. And it's time for us, for this particular time, wherever we are here, we fill our pockets. We are not, let's not lie to ourselves. Let's be honest with ourselves as Africans. A couple of governments, I don't want to go into names, still have that syndrome. But some governments are credible enough, and that's why I'll go back to your good question which you did pose earlier, trying to ask us, why the 4 countries? Probably, why not 6, why not 10? Or why not 4, which are not these ones? It does tell you a story. It does tell you that actually these guys are very smart enough, and I'll keep on telling you that. I'll make it a chorus need be, to make you understand that they are serious with the business they are doing. It's not only about even a question of checklisting, okay? They do know who, Anangwe, you know, let's look at it this way. Let me share something with you. When we used to negotiate with the European Union, you would find that if it's the European Union vis-a-vis Africa or Africa Pacific countries, you would find actually that within each committee, whether we are talking about, or let's zero in and say EU and East Africa, you'll find that at every point of the trade negotiations, at any committee, they have got a representative, at least one, who is the head of delegation, 2, a technocrat who looks at every typical clause and what it is, and the 3rd person, a researcher, who is going to know. Haguma is a Rwandan representative, Emery is the Tanzanian representative, my good friend Agatumba is a Ugandan representative. They zero in on us, and they find that actually we have not done our homework. And only to find that actually in Rwanda, this is how we can treat Haguma. They deal with him personally. Now, this is not the time we're supposed to be doing that. To allude to his good point of like, maybe we need a platform, to be honest with ourselves. When do we create real good negotiators for Africa? So that we can go there. But to try to answer your point, is that this particular legitimate government, which has been brought in by the particular populace, which goes by the universal suffrage of the 1 vote, that's what tells you that either you are not serving us, you have a mandate. I'll take, for example, into task my good president, Kagame. Right now, he's doing a great job. He's diplomat #1 for Rwanda. We all know that. Now, if something does go wrong, he's a smart president to understand that actually Rwandese will question him and will ask him, remember, we requested you to run. It was not his choice. And we like what he's doing right now. If he doesn't do that, the case rests with the Rwandese.
The case rests with the Rwandese. It's a very good question you posed there, that how, like, we need to have good negotiators. Haguma, how do we ensure that the interests of the citizens are actually covered and they're protected when negotiating such kind of deals with such kind of people of the magnitude of President Xi?
Well, this is a very important question because in September, the September 3rd to 4th of this year is the FOCAC, so the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. This is the most important platform for China-Africa cooperation. It will be attended by probably 50 presidents. It will be in Beijing. And this is the first time that FOCAC is happening under the new AU, which is being reformed by President Kagame. And already you can see the results. First of all, the AU is opening an embassy in Beijing. It had never had an embassy in Beijing. So there was no way for the AU to coordinate amongst its other embassies. Secondly, I've been to FOCAC, and the one comment you get from everybody is that all the proposals are coming from the Chinese side, which is as if the Africans did not have any thing to gain from or any request, but in fact they do. And so the Chinese have had it easy. They had the very 54 countries, they can divide and rule. Now with the new AU reform, I believe it will be a different story. And that is where you start from. So I think that we actually do have the negotiators. What we didn't have so far is the organization to say, this is our priorities, this is what we're aiming for, this is what West Africa wants, what East Africa wants, what Rwanda wants, and we combine them together to go to China, to go to Beijing in September with a concrete plan that involves all our wishes.
Right.
If you go to the Chinese and you each want your own thing, they will play you. And
So
that's
you'd
what
rather
has
go
been
as a
happening.
block?
You have to go as a
No,
block.
before you go,
We need to go
Yeah,
because
before you
Alice is
go.
on my ears,
Before you go,
but we have
two
been
things.
promised that we could be able to eat a bit into the news because our time was also eaten up during that live.
two things.
Just a few.
Even
1
as
minute, yes.
even as we put so much responsibility on China, we should remember that it's still regarded in many circles as a developing country.
It is.
It is the largest developing country. So Africa needs to put itself in a situation where we learn more from China than get more from China.
So we need to learn instead of wanting
yes,
to
because
get more.
it took them 40 years to
Right.
get where they are.
Right.
It has taken Rwanda 20 years to recover from the genocide. This is something we can replicate across Africa. The story
Learn
we
more
need,
from them
yes,
than
the
want
story we
more
need
from
China
them.
to help us is with integration of the African continent to
Yes.
ease trade and get us where China is, which
Right.
is, a major trading voice.
Right.
and-
Emery, I'll give you that one second to finish up as I go just to read the quick thoughts. Your closing thoughts. What do you think we should be doing as we look into this, as we receive these guests and get these opportunities for negotiations for partnerships?
Quickly, I'll just try and say that our government, Rwandan government, has done one thing which was very critical in terms of like changing the foreign policy approach in 2012.
Yes.
Kudos to Her Excellency Minister of Foreign Affairs, Louise Mushikiwabo, of course, under the tutelage of the President, Kagame Paul. And what we need to do right now is that, remember, Rwanda exports coffee, tea, minerals, animal hides back to China. We get finished goods from them. So this time round, I know we are going to be discussing on I think about 15 MOUs.
Yes.
Together with a couple of agreements.
Yes.
So I do expect that actually we need to have a watchful eye.
Yes.
When we go to each and every agreement and each and every MOU. And
We need to have a
especially-
watchful eye.
Yes, we need
I'll
to
take-
have a watchful
I'll
eye.
take that.
And I hope our government, which I trust so much, is going to do a good job.
Right, thank you so much. Very quickly, Amanya Franklin says, in 2014, China signed infrastructure contracts worth over $70 billion for the continent, and Chinese banks now provide more loans to African countries than the World Bank does. China is taking a soft move to overhaul the Western powers through economic influence. You think this is the way to go?
Yeah.
This is the way to go?
Yes.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
That's
of
not
course,
a yes or no question.
Thanks to Alice and the team at the controls room, it has to be a yes or no question. It is time for us to actually sign off and say bye-bye because it is the time that we had for this particular conversation. We want to say thank you for watching the program and being a part of it. Keep talking. The conversation continues. Hashtag, as always, In Focus RW. My name, as always, is Eugene Anangwe. Goodbye for now. Thank you.